This is just a short introduction to an area that I've been working on for a while now, around a concept that I call holiploigy. And it's really focused on how we might begin to take some of the ideas from using holiploigy to understand teaching, etc., to actually using it as a tool for thinking about the development of learning organisations. My background is one of working within the education sector, firstly as a school teacher and then as an academic. And during the whole of that period, which now extends to about 25 years, I've had an overriding interest in change, innovation and learning. To begin with, a lot of that interest was around teaching and learning in classrooms, and then seminar rooms within HE contexts, and driven really by a belief that perhaps certainly at an HE level we needed new models for teaching and learning and curriculum, etc. So that's sort of the background that I'm coming from. The work that I've done on this notion of holiploigy in relation to teaching, learning, etc., really comes from a perspective that we can't actually talk about concepts such as teaching or curriculum or assessment or learning within formal educative context, really, one divorced from the other. That actually we need to understand teaching, and that's why I put some full stops within brackets when I use words like teaching and learning, to try and begin to emphasize the idea that we can never just talk about teaching by itself. It's teaching in relation to, or teaching as part of, these other things. And that really teaching, curriculum, learning, assessment are all complex adaptive systems within their own rights. They're all made up of a tangle of processes. And obviously when they're working together, those different complex adaptive systems come together to create new entanglements. And that really, as a consequence, we're talking about a very, very complex set of processes that we are attempting to utilize successfully. And that because of this, because we're talking about truly complex processes. By complex processes, I mean processes that are to a degree emergent, non-linear, that we can't necessarily ahead of time predict exactly how something's going to go because of the emergent nature of working, say, in a seminar room. That ultimately we can't, as a result of that, say that there is one correct, predetermined way of approaching the various processes involved in helping people learn. It's highly contextualized, and therefore sort of some of the debate that certainly occurred within the school sector between this idea of either progressive or traditional approaches to education, many practitioners understand just as almost common sense that you can't actually pick one or the other, that actually different approaches will be of most use in particular contexts and for particular purposes. And therefore, one of the ideas around holiploigy is the idea that ultimately what we need to do is to think about the particular context that we're in at a particular point in time, and how the curriculum, the teaching, the learning and the assessment interact with one another within that particular context of interest in relation to both the tutor and the students. And looking at the diagram on the left hand side, that's what I'm trying to capture as the core of this model of holiploigy, is that it's the interaction between these different complex adaptive systems and how they play out and interact with both the tutor and the students that give us this sort of emergent process over time, which is why there's the circle with the arrows on it, that actually how these things play out will shift over time as those various processes begin to emerge. And that really, as a consequence, what a skilled lecturer or tutor or teacher is doing is using their experience, their understanding, etc., to understand best, as far as they are concerned, how those various things can fit together and how they can be utilized most successfully to try to aid students in maximizing the effectiveness of the learning process that they're going through, or learning processes that they're going through at any particular point in time. And as I started to think about all of this, I sort of went back to the work of Nigel Tubbs on the philosophy of the teacher, where he uses a simple model really of, or simple pair of analogies of teacher as master and teacher as servant. The idea of teacher as master being this more sort of process that's driven by the teacher being the knowledgeable individual, deciding how the learning is going to take place, creating the teaching experience, deciding what the curriculum looks like, etc., etc. And they are the master over the students. And then almost diametrically opposed to that is the idea of teacher as servant, where they're more the facilitator, and they're there really just to make sure that the students have the resources they need, or a little bit of pointing in the right direction. And obviously, as I've sort of said previously, this is an interesting pair of analogies, but ultimately they're not particularly useful, because ultimately they're diametrically opposed, and there's probably a huge amount of sort of territory in between those two extremes. And therefore I started sort of beginning to see the teaching aspect of this more complex set of processes as being analogous to navigation, perhaps due to my sort of geographical background, and the fact that for a long time I was a very keen mountaineer. And the reason I think it's analogous to navigation is the idea that when you're teaching somebody navigation, there is a general direction of travel, in that what we're trying to do is to help those people who we're teaching navigation to become really good navigators themselves. And therefore our role perhaps is at times to be leading the process, to be explaining things, to be right at the center of all of those processes, and determining how they unfold. For example, if we're lecturing or explaining something. But once we've started to explain those basics, once we started to give people that grounding in the basic knowledge they need, what we're then trying to do is give them ways of beginning to build the skills, the experience, the application of that knowledge outwards, so that they can begin to navigate themselves. And therefore, the way that I see the role of the teacher is really in this notion of navigation, that it's about helping people gain more knowledge, gain more skills, and move out into the sort of, so they can navigate these sort of landscapes of knowledge, navigate these landscapes of understanding and learning and skills, so that as they begin to do that, they can begin to do that more independently of us, but always with the proviso that if they're finding it difficult, or we can observe that they're having difficulties, we can pull them back in, we can go back to a more didactic way of working, so that it becomes much more about a developing set of principles, and using particular approaches to the process that are most useful at a given point in time. But as they become more confident, as they become more knowledgeable, become more expert in that landscape, if you like, that actually we allow them greater breadth and opportunity to go out and explore for themselves, and eventually get to the stage where they may be coming back to talk to us about parts of that landscape that they've navigated and explored that we ourselves only know in a very sketchy way or not at all. And therefore it's this idea that we are playing a crucial role in helping those students understand that landscape. I suppose in a sense it goes back to Gert Biester's idea that this isn't an egological way of working. This isn't the students just deciding how they're going to navigate and navigating the bits of the landscape that they're interested in, but it's a case of giving them a basic knowledge, helping them understand more complex and difficult bits of knowledge, etc., etc., so that ultimately they have the wherewithal to go out and, as I say, perhaps bring back parts of their exploration and navigation that begin to teach us things as well. And as a consequence, in the diagram, what I've done around the periphery is to give some idea of that kind of things that might be useful in helping us think through the complexity of the center of the model. And it is literally just illustrative. One of the big sort of assumptions that I make in this is that we can never capture this in its entirety because it's too big, it's too complex. Whatever kind of lists we try to create, there will always be things missing. So it's more really a diagram to engender reflection, discussion, thinking about how these various aspects might fit together and what might be important, rather than trying to be some kind of prescriptive, almost, if you like, predictive model. It's much more of a dialogic overview, sketch of an area that we can begin to use and begin to mold into our own context, etc. And the reason that I call this whole notion holiploigy is simply that within ancient Greek, I'm using the idea of holy meaning complex, and ploigos being navigation. So holiploigy is this idea of complex navigation, navigating complex areas of knowledge and understanding, and helping increasingly other people also begin to navigate those complex areas of knowledge. And therefore the sort of basic definition that I came up with this, which is still again very much a work in progress, is that holiploigy is the emergent enactment of the processes of educative experiences. So it's based on the complex interaction of curriculum, teaching, learning and assessment. All of those things we can't talk about student in a formal sense. We can't talk about learning without including all the other three. We can't talk about assessment without including all the other three. It's that complex interaction between them as enacted by tutors and students. So they themselves are meaningless without that enactment of the people who are making use of them. And the way those fit together, the way that those individuals and groups engage with those things will be mediated through the various philosophies that people will have around them and around the subject knowledge that they're engaging with, the context that they're working within, and hopefully ideas that research might give them as to how this might work well. And therefore, these emergent processes foster the growth of expertise in both tutors and students. It's the idea that actually the main focus is obviously on the students and helping them engage and to begin to navigate through these landscapes and get an ever better understanding and knowledge of them. But in doing that, that part of the real excitement of doing that is that they may actually bring back things that we ourselves don't know, or that we don't know particularly well. So we learn from the process as well. So this has been sort of an idea that I've been living with now for sort of 3 or 4 years and beginning to think about writing about. But if we then extend it out to sort of thinking not only about the learning of students and tutors within a seminar room context, actually, how can we begin to apply this to organisational learning and organisational change and development? There are some core principles, I think, that underpin these ideas that work potentially in an organisational context. And the first of those is this idea that we're talking about working within complex processual environments. Complex, as I was saying before, in this idea of them being non-linear, the idea that there's a whole series of interactions going on that aren't easy to predict if we're talking about a complex environment. Complicated systems we can. So an aircraft, for example, is a complicated system. In other words, there are a huge number of parts, there's a huge amount of interaction between them, but they're inherently predictable. So as long as we've designed the aircraft carefully and we understand how it all fits together, we can understand that if there's a particular input, then there should be a particular behavior and output. And that is very, very predictable. Otherwise, we wouldn't necessarily be too keen on getting onto an aeroplane to go somewhere. But a complex environment is one that again has many interactions, but they're non-linear. Small inputs can have large outputs, vice versa. Small inputs can have large outputs. And the processes by which they occur may not always be particularly easy to understand and define. Complex systems are difficult to predict at a particular scale. So the quintessential example of a complex system is the weather system. And even though we now have a huge amount of data input into predicting weather, even though we have very powerful computers that can do that, we still find it difficult to accurately predict the weather more than 3 or 4 days from the point at which we're trying to do the prediction, because actually it's a complex adaptive system, and that means that there are so many elements that interact in so many interesting ways that we can't easily model, that we can't predict in fine detail much beyond a few days. We can predict in a very general sense quite a long way ahead, because complex systems are not random, they're not chaotic, and therefore they do have patterns. And again, within the context of an example of weather, whilst we can't predict in fine detail the weather 5 days into the future, we nevertheless can say, well, okay, we're in the middle of March. Generally speaking, by the time we get to June or July, it's going to be warmer. It might generally be a bit more sunny. But then as we go back into November and December next year, it's probably going to be colder. We might get the odd bit of snow. It's probably going to be wetter. In other words, we can predict at a climatic level what the general trends will be, but not the absolute detail. And likewise in a classroom, because a classroom is a whole set of complex processes and complex adaptive systems all interacting with one another, we can predict generally what's going to happen. We'll generally know what a particular class is going to be like and what we might expect, but we can't predict the detail of, what somebody's going to say at minute 33 or exactly how they're going to learn something by the end of the session, because of the complex nature of the environment that we're in, the system that we're in. So I see this as being about complex environments. Organizations are complex environments, and I see them as primarily processual in nature. What I mean by that is that within any organization, there's a lot of materiality. Of course, there's people, there's buildings, there's computers, tables, pens, whatever it might be. But actually, it's the processes that are driving that organization. It's the processes that are fundamental to the emergence of that organization over time. Even in things like research and development, it's actually the processes and the emergent processes that lead to the emergent materiality of, say, new gizmos or new clothes if it's a fashion organization. So the materiality is there and it's important, but it's driven by the underlying processes, and they are complex in nature. So what we need to do if we're thinking about change in organizations, if we're thinking about learning within organizations, is that within that complexity, we need to understand appropriate responses to the need for learning and to the need for change. With being a teacher, you might be using more didactic approaches at one point and more sort of independent discovery approaches at others. Likewise, within an organizational context, we can't just decide before we start with a particular change or a particular area of learning that we're going to do it in this particular way, and that's how it's going to work. We need to think about where people are and how we can work with them in the most appropriate way at any particular point in time to maximize the opportunity that the change will be successful, or that we can really begin to drive learning within the organization itself. And therefore, over a period of time, as we do these kinds of things, as we begin to think about how we might help people learn within the context that they're in, we have to see it as an emerging process of people understanding new ways of understanding things, gaining new areas of knowledge, beginning to apply things in different ways. But we need to do that in a holistic way. We need to sort of think about, well, okay, then if we're bringing this change in, what impacts does that have on other parts of people's work, or what other kinds of knowledge are people going to need to make this successful? We need to think holistically about the change that we're bringing in, not seeing it as sort of some little hermetically sealed project that doesn't have an impact on the organization around it. And similarly, if we're helping people learn. So the kind of things that we might be involved in, the kind of things that we might be attempting to do, is to help people develop their confidence, develop their knowledge, develop the application through a whole series of different approaches. It might be exposition at some point. It might be most effective to bring a group of people together and do a more traditional input about a particular change that they may have to take on board. But that is going to be not only about developing their knowledge and their understanding, but also about building their confidence and supporting them in ways in which they can take that new knowledge out into their landscape and begin to apply it and understand it and play with it. And this I sort of see as being almost a sort of what you might call a yo-yo approach. This comes from a conversation I had with a teacher a number of years back when we were doing some curriculum development about teaching hurricanes, and we were doing it by using sort of an internal website. And the idea there was that at some points the teacher might be leading the class and might be doing quite traditional inputs into their learning, but at other points he was then allowing them to go away and use information on the websites we created to develop their understanding further. And he saw that as being what he called a yo-yo approach. In other words, you can send them out like flinging out a yo-yo, but I can always bring them back in if I need to and do some more core work with them. So it becomes almost a sort of a yo-yo approach. And what we can then do is begin through engaging with people, thinking about the kind of things they're doing, how they want to develop them, how the organization wants to develop. We can begin to see that as being this idea of them exploring the landscape of the changes that they're trying to go through, the work that they're attempting to do. It's about them beginning to make sense of that and reporting back and coming back and talking about the kind of things they've been doing, to see how it's embedding, to see how the change is going, and importantly, perhaps to alter the nature of the change itself in relation to the kind of new landscapes that they're exploring. And therefore, another core principle of holiploigy in an organizational sense would be this idea of it being dialogic and collaborative, that it's about people having the opportunity to talk and to discuss and to consider and reflect on their emerging experiences as they're beginning to learn and they're beginning to affect change, and therefore that it's an inherently collaborative process, and that collaboration is perhaps driven by the people who are instigating and developing that change, rather than say a leader or a manager. They may be there to help some of the dialogue, some of the collaboration, facilitate it in a way that allows people to have the time and space to do it properly, and also taking feedback from those dialogues and that collaboration so they can begin to understand at a more whole organizational level the direction in which things are going and how it's working through. But to get this to work, certainly in some organisations, this may require quite a lot of culture building and beginning to alter the way that work itself and the kind of tasks that people are responsible for, beginning to see those in a different cultural light as we move towards people seeing themselves as being navigators and explorers rather than just recipients of particular bits of information or recipients of particular bits of change. And therefore, there's a whole series of processes that become important within this. So, for example, as we've said, sort of dialogue and collaboration, and authentic collaboration, not forced collaboration, allowing people to find the collaborations that are most useful in helping them meet the goals that they've set themselves or the trajectories that they've set themselves upon. And perhaps really core to a lot of this is the idea of psychological safety, the work by Edmondson on fearless organisations. And what Edmondson argues is that there are many organisations, and I think there are certainly many organisations within education where people feel psychologically unsafe. In other words, they're not willing to speak back. They're not willing to talk about problems and issues and things that aren't working within the organization for fear that they will be ostracized, sidelined, possibly even lose their jobs. And that therefore, because of that, they begin just not to engage. They may see in their own areas that there are problems and issues, but they daren't tell anybody higher up the hierarchy in case they get into trouble. And her book on psychological safety and fearless organizations is replete with examples of big corporations that have had serious failures because of the fact that people were not willing to talk. And one of the most interesting examples, I think, from her book is from her own PhD research, where they were trying to look at effective medical teams in hospitals. And they wanted to look at effectiveness as against failure. And what they were finding was really sort of counterintuitive to begin with, was that the teams that had the best outcomes, the teams that seemed to be working the best, also seemed to have the highest rate of failure and the highest rate of people saying that there were problems. And it was only once they started to actually explore this further that what they realized was that those teams where it was accepted to talk about failures and to talk about problems and to then use those as a basis for moving forward were the strongest teams, whereas the other teams that on the face of it seemed to have far fewer problems had far fewer problems because people just weren't willing to talk about them, and that's what had led to them having higher rates of failure. And it's only through having psychological safety that we can really begin then to use things like reflection as a main way of beginning to understand where we are, where the problems are, where we might move forward, and having openness to admitting to problems and failure, admitting to not understanding things, so that actually we can maximize the learning potential within our organization. And alongside the reflection, actually beginning to dream, actually dreaming about saying, well, what might those landscapes look like that we want to navigate through? What kind of things would we want to see, and how might we get there? How might we navigate our way towards them? And in doing that, we have to perhaps develop cultures within organizations that allow risk taking and the exploring of landscapes. Not rash risk taking, it has to be risk taking that is based on something, but people not playing safe all the time. Because if we play safe all the time, in a sense, we're going to restrict ourselves to just doing the things that either somebody further up the hierarchy tells us is right, or things that we already do that we know work. And that stops us from exploring those wider landscapes that some of the time may not work, but some of the time may actually take us into new areas that actually fundamentally change the way that we do things for the better. And as a consequence, we also need to be happy to fail. There's a fantastic book by Isk called The Institute of Brilliant Failures, and he gives a very strong set of arguments around the idea that it's actually through failure quite often that we learn new ways of working, and we can take our organizations on. And therefore we need to be happy to fail. We don't want to fail all the time. We don't want to sort of make failure something that is ingrained and the majority experience, but we need to be pushing the boundaries. We need to be able to fail in particular things, because actually, as long as we make positive use of that failure through reflection and learning, understanding why something hasn't worked and how it might be done better, that we can actually move forward. And it's by doing these various things that we can begin to learn more, that we can begin to instigate change in a more positive way. And that is then giving us the basis for adaptability within our organizations, that people are freed up to begin to think about what's best around what they do, how they know it's the best, but areas where they could improve and how they might get there, how they might navigate their way to something better with support wherever it's needed. And within all of this, as a result, we need to begin then to think about a different way of understanding change in its own right. In a lot of, particularly in the educational sector, organizations tend to be very much driven by planned change. These are big projects, often instigated by senior leaders or senior members of staff, and everybody else is just essentially along for the ride. And that planned change will normally sort of start from one position. There'll be an end date by which it needs to be completed. Often in educational organizations, it's either a year or a 2-year project, not because a year is the best amount of time that's required, but that's how it fits into the calendar the best. And you have somebody from the top driving that planned change. There's a number of steps that have to be gone through. You rag rate as you go along, you tick off as you go along, and it starts from an inception date to the day that it's rolled out and it's completed, and you know that it's completed. Now, there is a place for planned change. It's certainly coherent change, and as long as it's well thought through, planned change can be very successful. However, there seems to be evidence that there is probably more failed change than successful change. And I would argue that within educational organisations, there's one particular type of failed change, which is absolutely almost ubiquitous within education, I would have said, to a certain extent, and that's what I would call zombie innovation, where somebody at the top of the organization instigates a change project, they drive it through, and by the end they have the evidence from everybody else in the organization that it has been successful. And therefore we've gone through this great change process. It's now embedded within practice. It's been a complete success. Whilst the people at the bottom know that they've done enough to get enough evaluative data to make the people at the top feel happy about what they've done, and to make it feel as if the change has worked incredibly well, but actually to a great degree their day-to-day activity hasn't actually changed. They've almost sort of, in a sense, sort of subsumed that change, and after the initial sort of halo effect, have just sort of put it to one side and gone back to what they were doing before. And the reason I call that zombie innovation is that the people at the top think it's successful. The people at the bottom know that they've got away with it again. They've managed to fend it off and just get on with the massive amount of work that they have to do, because actually the change project to their mind wasn't a particularly useful change project anyway. And the innovation itself is left staggering around in the twilight, neither alive nor dead, and just left staggering around, and people have then moved on to the next thing. So that organizations have, if you like, a sort of metaphorical cupboard full of sort of zombies just wandering around. Nobody's killed them off and decided it's not worth it. It's not in the full light of day and operating with embedded practice. It's just that in that twilight of the undead. But whilst most organisations understand how much planned organisation is going on, they're very bad at capturing emergent change. And the idea of emergent change is that any organisation has a multitude of change going on all the time. It's the micro changes, it's the day-to-day shifts in practice, that somebody might have altered slightly a session that they give, or they might have rewritten a session, or they might be working with students in a slightly different way. And as a consequence, over a period of time, there is that constant shift, that constant change, which is just part of the everyday life of organisations and will always occur. But actually, organisations are incredibly bad at capturing it. And therefore, quite often, many of the people who are responsible formally for change within organisations don't have any idea that this is going on. So if we want to create a really fantastic learning organisation, then Holiploigic might have something to offer here in that idea of seeing people who are in some way, shape or form at whatever level of the organisation are responsible for change are not necessarily doing it didactically and in a planned way, but are working with and alongside other people who are making these changes and getting constant sort of sense giving and sense making going on to help them understand how the thing is moving forward. And there's lots of different ways of capturing that learning. In a more formal sense, you may have things like brains trusts, so getting groups of people together to discuss what they've been doing over the last period and what they've found and how it's worked, and sharing ideas in a more formal way with the sort of the organizational leader at whatever level. They're more to just sort of listen and try and capture what's been going on and to facilitate more exploration and navigation and to help people build the kind of networks within those landscapes that are going to maximize the amount of learning that's coming out of the situation. Certainly not then wanting to bureaucratize it. And one of the problems with emergent change is if you begin to try and bureaucratize it and capture it in a very bureaucratic way, that then, this is the new way that we've got to do this and everybody should be doing this, you'll kill that emergent change off almost immediately. But also, another way of capturing that emergent change is to give people the time and the space for informal chat. And certainly within educational organisations, this is something that has fallen off a cliff face, really. In the sense that, 20 odd years ago, people would have enough time perhaps to go and sit down in a staff room for half an hour or to get a cup of coffee in the morning. And it's in those informal periods of chat that actually that emergent change can be shared and amplified and moved across the organization, allowing people to understand the sort of landscape that they're navigating through in new and interesting ways. But over a period of time, people have become the level of temporal intensification, the amount that people are expected to do means that most staff rooms now, if they still exist in schools or common rooms within university, have been got rid of because hardly anybody's in them, because people don't have time to frequent those areas. I remember some time ago doing some research on a building schools for the future school, where I'd done some observations in the old school before they moved, and there was a single staff room. It was almost too small for the staff because the school had grown over time. But the senior leaders used to get tea and coffee for everybody for free. They would give them cakes on a Friday, and as a result, people would all go down to that staff room. And they would all be talking. A lot of the talk obviously wasn't about education, people having a bit of downtime, but some of the conversation was. It was sharing intelligence about particular students in different subjects, or talking about something that they'd tried out that had been really successful and they were really enthusiastic about it. 9 months later, I went back, and the school's in its new buildings. There were little offices for all the various subject areas. So people were tending to stay down there. They were sort of almost balkanizing into their little subject areas. And there was a massive staff room. And I went in one lunchtime, and right over the far side, miles away from where I was, there were three sort of forlorn-looking um, teaching assistants sort of munching on a bit of celery, and that was it. And I was on my way out, and the head teacher came and saw me and sort of said, you got 10 minutes. When we started having a chat, you sort of saying, there's just no more innovation anymore. People just sort of seem to be going through the motions. And I sort of said, well, yeah, it used to be vibrant because people used to have an opportunity to talk informally, to share ideas, to capture the learning, and to help each other navigate their way through new ways of doing things and trying things out. And there was an excitement. Now, A, they're busy. B, some of those staff rooms, you'd have to walk for 10 minutes to get your coffee before you got to the staff room, and so that by the time you got there, you'd have to go straight back again. And as a result, you've cut the lifeblood of informal chat. And there's plenty of research that demonstrates that actually what drives change in organisations through this emergent set of processes is that time for informal chat, just to chat about stuff, and a space to do it in, or spaces to do it in, water cooler chat if you like, that has been lost in many organizations because for some bizarre reason it's seen as being inefficient. People need to be much more efficient in how they use their time. What actually happens is they become far less efficient, far less effective in taking on new learning, finding new ways of doing things, and bringing emergent change to the organization. So, just as a very basic starting point, really, as a bit of a model of holoploidy for organizational learning, it's similar as to the one for seminar rooms, but instead of curriculum, teaching, learning, and assessment, instead we've got change, collaboration, learning, and reflection. And this is a model in work in process, very much so. But it's that idea that all of these sort of complex adaptive systems are all interplaying with one another, and they're made sense of and interplay in the context of the particular employers, employees, and stakeholders within the organization and beyond it, and that all of this alters over time and alters through events, to give this sort of emergent pattern and emergent way of working. But to finish off with, this sort of presents certain interesting questions that we then need to think about. If we're taking a holoploigic approach to organizational change, supporting people, working with people to explore landscapes of new practice, of new understanding, whatever it might be. First of all, can hierarchies work well within this approach? And the cartoon here is a bit tongue-in-cheek, but certainly within many UK universities, I think many lecturers would argue that it's not too far of the mark. And that actually, if we're going to have something that captures emergent change, that is psychologically safe, that is allowable of failure as long as it's learnt from, that is about adaptability, actually very sclerotic hierarchies just won't work with this kind of approach, because all you need is one or two people at the top of the organization to say no, and whole sections of the organization can become frozen. And as a consequence, you can get quite a lot of resentment building up, people feeling that they're not taken seriously, and that leaders, rightly or wrongly, see themselves as almost being omnipotent. And in the past, I have written a blog post on asking whether or not education has a problem with philosopher kings, the idea that the person at the top of the organization has some special understanding, and that it's them who needs to sort of set the course for the organization and have all of the answers, ably supported by the guardians, their senior leaders and senior professional services directors who sort of see the vision that they want, and then with downward pressure make sure that that's what is instigated, again through planned change. So perhaps we need to start thinking differently about hierarchies and differently about organizational structures if we're going to release this great potential for learning and development and change. And as part of that, we need to start beginning to think seriously about how we ensure psychological safety and the ability for sharing. If we are in a psychologically unsafe organization, there is a restricted, if not completely lost, ability to share and to learn and to move the organization forward. But if we can create psychological safety where leaders at all levels are happy to admit that they may not know all the answers, that they may get things wrong, because actually you're fostering a culture where it's okay to fail as long as you learn from it. Failure with no learning is a very negative thing, but if we begin to build those kind of cultures, then actually we can begin to create psychologically safe environments where people can really begin to think through problems and issues and help the organization to develop. And therefore, we need these if we're going to foster this culture of navigation and exploration, giving people the tools and the emergent expertise to be able to navigate their way through their development, to explore new areas that perhaps we've not seen before. But one of the difficulties with this is obviously, if we're not careful, people might just go off in every direction available and the whole thing begins to be incoherent and falls apart because there's no general trajectory in the same direction. So how do we keep it coherent? And this is where complexity theory and emergence can help, because one of the ways of creating positive emergence is to give people a huge amount of freedom, but doing that within particular boundaries. So what you do is you begin by setting the boundaries. We want you to go and explore, we want you to navigate, we want you to go and learn and develop and change, but within these boundaries. And you have to stay within these boundaries, but within those boundaries there's a huge amount of freedom. And if we do that, we can create an organization where there is still a decent level of coherence, but where the processes of navigation or exploration are helping us move forward. Within this, there are really important roles for both coaching and mentoring, both individually and in groups, and for coaching mentors to get a lot of sense giving from those who they're working with, so that they can then use that themselves, not only to work with the groups or individuals that they're working with more, but also to bring those ideas to the attention of others within the organization, including the leadership, so that the whole organization can begin to draw upon a wealth of learning and information. But leadership then has to be different. Within educational organizations, leadership, partly because of the research literature and the fact that leadership has become a real focus within the research literature, way more importantly than the notions of organizations, leaders have begun to be seen almost in a sense as being separate from the organizations of which they should be a part. In universities, senior leadership teams are often seen as being awfully remote and almost above the organization. So we need to think about leadership differently. And perhaps what we need is to think about organization first and foremost. Think about how organizations are, how they interact, what kind of cultures they have, and then how leadership fits within that as a really important, crucial element of the organization, so that leaders are no longer seen as being outside of the organization, but integrally embedded into it, but not the final word in everything. And as a consequence of that, another thing that we then need to do is to think about how we characterize and understand culture, informal cultures, formal cultures, the idea that organizations won't have a single culture, they'll have a series of cultures. Within schools, I remember as a kid, if you had to go and find a science teacher during morning break, all of the science department were always in a little prep room. That was their little staff room that they always had. That was a very different culture to other parts of the organization. There's nothing wrong with that in the slightest, but how do we begin to understand those cultures, and how do we begin to understand how we can bring them together? And then finally, what's the role of accountability in all of this? Sarah Green wrote a fantastic book in 2011 around accountability in education, and one of the main ideas that she appears to have is the idea that where you have more accountability, almost by definition, you have less trust, that the two can't coexist together. And therefore, if we have, as educational organisations do at the moment, and organisations in other sectors, have very, very heavy accountability systems, how can we at the same time then build the trust and the culture of exploration that we want people to have if they're always worried about accountability? It's interesting that in many other sectors, the notion of performance management and annual reviews has gone out the window, because perhaps it's seen as restricting people from actually playing their full professional role and their full role in being able to explore and navigate and develop within the landscapes within which they work. And therefore, perhaps what we need to do is resurrect the idea of thinking about responsibility rather than accountability. Accountability is a very, or can be a very sort of quantitative, restrictive thing. Responsibility is much more about ethics and culture and people understanding the responsibility they have to others and indeed to themselves. And perhaps what we need to do is to begin to think about systems of responsibility rather than systems of accountability, as a way then of making sure that people are still on the ball and still doing their best, but doing that in terms of their responsibilities within the organization and indeed their responsibility towards a culture of trust and exploration. So these are just some sort of questions really that we need to think about, because if we go down this route of thinking about organizational learning through holiploidy and organizational change through holiploidy, it suggests to us that we may have to change quite radically some of the organizational structures that we're used to, and just sort of some of the assumptions we make about how organizations work. And just to finish off with, these are sort of some of the texts that I've found most useful in helping me begin to develop a lot of these ideas and begin to sort of cohere a series of ideas from different areas. And finally, just to say that obviously this is still very much a work in progress. The holiploigic notion of organizational learning and change is something that's very new and something I'm still trying to work my way through. The sort of seminar sort of teaching side of it, if you like, is a lot more thought through, partly because of my own sort of cultural experiences, etc. But this is really just a way of trying to sort of give an idea of sort of some of the ideas that we're working with at present.